The sun was sinking low over the western hills, painting the Dalton ranch in bands of copper and lavender. The cattle were quiet in their pens, the air heavy with the scent of hay, horse sweat, and wood smoke from the kitchen chimney. A figure moved slowly up the long road that led to the wide veranda of the grand ranch house, a figure so slight and worn she seemed a shadow made flesh. Clara May walked with her arms folded across her thin chest, barefoot, her hem ragged with dust, her eyes hollow as if hunger had carved them into her face. Every step she took was weighed down by shame, though her body carried little else. She reached the gate and paused, gripping the weathered wood as though she needed permission even to lean against it. The ranch looked far too fine for the likes of her: whitewashed fences, neat corrals, a house trimmed with green shutters. She whispered under her breath, not sure if the evening air would carry her plea. All she asked for was a scrap of food, a corner of ground where she might curl and wait for sleep. Her voice cracked like brittle straw, half swallowed by the sound of the cicadas starting up in the grass. The first to notice her was a ranch hand coming from the barn. He stopped mid-step, squinting at the ragged stranger as if she were a stray coyote nosing too close. He muttered something under his breath, spat into the dirt, and turned away. The motion stung more than words, a refusal to even look at her properly. Clara lowered her eyes, wishing the earth would swallow her. She had grown used to such dismissal. It had chased her from saloon doors, from church porches, from the back steps of mercantiles. But still, each time it pierced anew. The screen door of the ranch house creaked open, and from the warm interior stepped Mrs. Dalton, the matron of the household. She wore a silken shawl despite the dust, her hair piled in perfect coils. Her gaze fell on Clara, sharp as a hawk's, and she drew the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Lord help us," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "Another beggar. This place is no charity." Her words were not shouted, but they struck with the finality of a gavel. Several ranch hands lingering nearby smirked, pretending not to watch too closely, feeding their whispers to one another. Clara felt the judgment like smoke curling around her, choking. The label they gave her, beggar, stray, fallen, wrapped itself around her neck tighter than a noose. Clara's stomach clawed at her ribs as the scent of beef stew drifted from the open window. She dug her nails into her palms, fighting back tears. A memory of her childhood surfaced. Her mother handing her a piece of cornbread still warm from the skillet, telling her that bread shared with kindness could keep a soul whole. That was long gone now, burned away by loss and wandering. She had nothing left but the hunger and the shame. It was then that a smaller voice cut through the evening. From the shadow of the doorway stepped a child, perhaps 8 years old, golden braids loose from her ribbon, a rag doll clutched against her chest. Abigail Dalton looked with wide eyes at the stranger hunched by the gate. She did not shrink back. Instead, she tilted her head and asked in the plain honesty only children carry, "Are you cold, ma'am?" The girl's words fell like water on parched ground. Clara blinked, unable to answer. Her lips trembled, and though she tried to muster pride, all that escaped was a faint nod. Abigail dug into her apron pocket and pulled out a biscuit, still soft, crumbs clinging to her small fingers. She stretched it out toward the stranger. "Mama says I shouldn't spoil my supper, but I think you need it more." Clara's hand shook as she reached forward. Hunger won over hesitation, and the first bite filled her with a heat that was almost painful in its sweetness. Tears rolled unbidden down her cheeks, falling into the dirt at her feet. The little girl smiled as if this exchange were the simplest thing in the world. Abigail's hand slipped into hers, tiny and warm. "You can sit on the porch," she said with childlike certainty. "Papa won't mind." Clara's breath caught. She wanted to protest, to pull away, to keep herself from inviting more shame. But the girl tugged gently, and Clara allowed herself to follow, step by trembling step toward the wide veranda bathed in lamplight. From the far end of the porch, another figure emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the quiet ease of a man who carried both authority and solitude. Red Dalton, the rancher himself, leaned against a post, his hat tipped low against the glow. His eyes found Clara, and for a long moment he said nothing. Silence can be heavier than any spoken word, and she braced for the dismissal she knew was coming. But Rhett did not scowl, did not gesture for her to leave. He simply studied her with an expression unreadable, weathered by sun and years of hard riding. When his gaze shifted to Abigail, he gave the smallest nod, and that was answer enough. Permission, without the burden of pity. The whispers in the yard thickened, a dozen invisible threads pulling at Clara, warning her she had stepped somewhere she did not belong. "He'll regret it," someone muttered. "Mark my words." Yet Rhett's silence stood like a wall against the noise. Without flourish or declaration, he allowed her to remain, and in that allowance was a fragile mercy. Clara sank down on the edge of the porch, clutching the shawl about her shoulders. The wooden boards were rough beneath her, but they held. She could hear the steady rhythm of the rocking chairs as the evening deepened, the creak and sway like a lullaby she had not known in years. Across the yard, the cattle settled, the stars opened their first white eyes in the sky. She drew in a breath and felt it catch, not from fear but from the unfamiliar weight of being allowed to exist in peace, even for an hour. As the household withdrew into night, Clara curled herself into a corner of the veranda, her body trembling less from cold and more from the loosening of long-carried shame. She whispered into the dark, words she had no audience for. "Maybe tomorrow I'll deserve to breathe a little easier." Her voice was nearly lost in the hum of crickets, but it steadied her nonetheless. She laid her head against the porch rail, and for the first time in many months, her eyes closed with something like hope stirring in her chest. In the window above, Abigail pressed her face to the glass, her doll tucked beneath her chin. Watching the stranger sleep, she whispered into the night, "I wish she could be Mama." The words floated out into the starlit dark, unheard by those below, yet carrying a promise the air itself seemed to hold close. And with that innocent wish, the night drew still, leaving the story suspended, its next breath waiting just beyond the horizon. The days lengthened into weeks, and though Clara May was never openly invited into the Dalton household, she remained near its heart. At dawn she swept the porch before the family stirred, and in the evenings she patched socks left forgotten on the line. She found a strange solace in small labors that belonged to no one but helped everyone. The gossip from town stretched long fingers even out to the ranch, whispering that the Daltons had taken in a beggar, that Rhett Dalton's silence was a fool's mercy. Clara heard those whispers in the crackling air at the mercantile, in the stiff stares at the well, in the way other women gathered their children closer when she passed. Shame pressed hard against her, yet she found her hands steady when Abigail slipped them into hers. It was the child's trust that held her upright, that let her endure what her pride could not. Rhett watched quietly from the edges. He was a man who spoke with his shoulders and his silences rather than his tongue. When one of the ranch hands dared mutter something cruel in Clara's hearing, Rhett's gaze alone silenced him. That gaze was not heated with anger, nor softened with pity. It was an iron reminder that his word was law on this land. Clara felt it each time he looked her way. He did not praise her nor dismiss her, and in that neutrality lay a respect she had never known. His lack of judgment was a quiet reprieve. Abigail, unburdened by the weight of adult tongues, grew ever nearer. She begged Clara for stories before bed, clambered into her lap when knees were scraped, and listened with wide eyes to every tale Clara could half remember from her own mother's faded songs. Each moment with the girl stitched Clara closer to belonging, though she feared the seam might tear at the first sharp tug of disapproval. She dared not imagine herself part of the family, yet she could not keep from leaning toward the warmth Abigail offered. The town's patience frayed on a Sunday morning when the Daltons prepared for church. Clara hesitated at the threshold, clutching the shawl Abigail had draped over her shoulders, whispering she should stay behind. But the child insisted, tugging her hand, declaring she belonged with them. Reluctantly, Clara walked beside Rhett and his daughter through the dusty main street. The world slowed to a hush of eyes and whispers. A woman with a lace parasol tilted her head and spoke just loud enough for Clara to hear. "Imagine letting a beggar near your child." The words sliced as if meant to bleed her spirit dry. Clara faltered, her hand trembling in Abigail's grip. She prepared to step away, to flee back to the outskirts where shame was safer than scorn. But Abigail held fast. Her voice, small yet ringing with defiance, rose above the murmurs. "She's my mama now." The words startled even Clara, freezing her breath in her throat. Silence swept the street, broken only by the creak of harness leather and the shuffle of boots. Gasps whispered through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. Clara's knees weakened, torn between terror and awe at what the child had just claimed. She opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came. Rhett stepped forward then, his figure cutting against the sun. His voice was low, unhurried, but it carried with the weight of iron. "In this house, we don't measure worth by gossip." The simple declaration spread across the gathered crowd, each syllable laid like a stone that could not be moved. The onlookers shifted uncomfortably, murmurs broken apart, eyes casting down. Clara's chest burned as if she had swallowed fire. What she had expected was dismissal, perhaps even contempt, yet here was a man standing between her and the judgment of the world, not with promises or flourish, but with the steady refusal to let cruelty define her. That night, Clara sought refuge in the loft of the barn. The scent of hay and leather surrounded her as she sat in the dark, trembling with all the weight of what had happened. Abigail's declaration rang in her ears, a refrain she was both desperate to believe and terrified to accept. She pressed her face into her hands, ashamed of daring to want more than survival. Belonging was dangerous. It could be torn away at any moment. Better to remain invisible than to risk the ache of being cast out again. The ladder creaked, and a glow spread across the loft as Rhett climbed into the space with a lantern. He did not speak at first, simply set the lantern down, its light spilling gold over the straw. In his other hand, he carried a loaf of bread and a folded blanket. He placed them near her without ceremony and lowered himself onto a bale nearby. His silence was thick, yet it carried more comfort than words might have. He was not here to question her, not here to scold her for shame or pride. His presence was enough. Moments later Abigail scrambled up, her doll clutched tight, her face alight with a child's certainty. She clambered into Clara's lap as though it were her rightful place, nestling against her chest. "You were always my mama," she whispered, drowsy with sleep. "God just took a while to show Papa." The words fell soft, yet their weight pressed deep into Clara's heart, cracking open something long buried. For the first time in years, she let tears fall freely, not from hunger or rejection but from a release that felt almost holy. Rhett sat nearby, silent still, the faintest trace of a nod acknowledging the bond that had formed before his eyes. His lantern burned steadily, casting a circle of light around them, as if holding back the world outside. Clara felt the ache of her loneliness begin to ease, replaced with a fragile, startling warmth. She was no longer merely a shadow clinging to scraps. She was a woman being seen, being trusted, being claimed by a child and quietly protected by a man who said little but whose actions thundered louder than any proclamation. The night deepened around them, but within the loft there was a stillness that felt like the start of something new. Clara held Abigail close, inhaling the scent of hay and childhood, her heartbeat steadying beneath the weight of the girl's trust. Rhett's steady presence across from her grounded the moment, a reminder that though the world outside would always gossip, inside these walls she had begun to find her place. She did not yet dare call it home, but she let herself whisper a thank you into the quiet, a prayer meant for no one yet heard by both. Outside, the crickets sang and the stars wheeled overhead, unbothered by human judgment. Inside, a beggar who had asked for scraps and a corner found herself with bread, a blanket, and a child's love pressed against her chest. The story was far from finished, but the ache in her bones had softened into something like belonging. The lantern burned steady, and the night carried them forward toward whatever dawn might bring.